listener production.
Hello, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Did you know the Environment Minister is being taken to the federal court over accusations she's failed to meet her legal duties to protect threatened species?
As soon as you have ecosystems starting to collapse, species starting to disappear, that's when all of a sudden there's water shortages, or that's when certain native flora and fauna become harder to find. So we view this as really important and as deserving the resources.
Helen Smith's chat with the conservation group Suing Tanya Plibersek is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Monday, the 10th of March.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. And morning to Helen Smith, who covered for me last week. I hope you're enjoying a sleep in. We begin today with ex-tropical cyclone Alfred, which is continuing to move inland after lashing southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales with torrential rain and damaging winds over the weekend. The storm didn't pack as big of a punch as first feared, though, and was downgraded to a Category 1 storm as it made landfall early on Saturday morning. Alfred still brought with it months' worth of rain, with the Bureau of Meteorology saying more than 800 mils has fallen in places like Dorrigo since 9 a.m. yesterday, while Brisbane copped 2 months' worth in just 24 hours.
Yeah, and right now, more than 250,000 people remain without power across the storm's impact zone. Most of those are in Queensland, and they have started work to restore those properties. There's also been relief for residents of Lismore, where flood levels did not reach their expected peaks, which did allow a lifting of evacuation orders. Obviously, people in that region are so flood weary, especially they're still cleaning up after the 2022 floods. So a relief for people who weren't as heavily impacted as first feared. However, flood warnings do remain in place for some parts today in Queensland and in New South Wales, and hundreds more mils of rain is expected to fall and continue into the middle of the week. And then it's from about Wednesday that they're expecting that the impacts from ex-tropical cyclone Alfred are going to ease off. As always, you can stay up to date with what's going on where you live by visiting disaster.qld.gov.au or the Hazards Near Me app if you are in New South Wales.
And tragically, a 61-year-old man has died after being swept into floodwaters in northern New South Wales on Friday. And also, we've seen 13 people injured in a crash involving 2 ADF vehicles near Lismore. They're all expected to make a full recovery, but 2 soldiers remained in a serious condition overnight.
Also, last night, a man was charged over an alleged assault at an evacuation centre in Mullumbimby in New South Wales that left another man injured. Now, look, across both states, hundreds of schools are staying closed today, and some public transport services are starting to resume across flood-affected areas. But again, just check with your local provider whether that's going ahead or not. But yeah, the advice for a lot of people is still to just stay home and just, the worst isn't over yet. Luckily, the fears of a really heavy impact haven't come to fruition, which is a relief, but it's still dangerous, so be careful.
Yeah, and that's despite the international reports that are showing Australians taking to the surf and taking to muddy hills and, playing with boogie boards and stuff like that. Like, yes, people are having fun and they're allowed to do, I guess, what they want to do, but a lot of people are putting themselves in harm's way, and as we've heard, there's a lot that our emergency services are responding to, so best just to stay indoors and stick with the advice. Staying home, support for the coalition remains ahead of Labor, despite Anthony Albanese extending his lead as the preferred Prime Minister. According to the latest Newspoll out today, the opposition is leading by 51% to the government's 49%, two-party preferred. And that's the same result as the previous survey, which was in February. Interestingly, Albo increased his 5-point lead to 9%, now the preferred Prime Minister, by 47%, compared to Peter Dutton's 38%. The opposition leader suffering a 2-point slide in his approval rating and an equal rise in voter dissatisfaction.
And this is the first time since late last year that Albanese has recorded a better approval rating than his opponent. As for overall party support, the Greens stayed on 12%, as did Pauline Hanson's One Nation, which is on 7%. Now, this all comes as the PM is no doubt feeling buoyed by Labor's third consecutive win in the WA state election over the weekend, the party claiming 40 seats, while the Liberals picked up 5, the Nationals managed 4. Premier Roger Cook describing the win as an emphatic victory for Labor.
At times of global uncertainty, the WA community has put its trust in our WA Labor team for the next 4 years. Western Australia has voted for a future which is made in WA.
Now, the PM also came out to praise the Premier and WA Labor for its discipline in government and throughout the campaign.
To put it in context, this is the second largest victory in history in Western Australia.
Well, look, it's a mixed result in WA. In a seat like Collie, where we've announced the nuclear reactor, there was a 20% swing to the Liberals in that seat.
So that was Peter Dutton at the end there, saying that it's not all bad. Yeah, Labor won, but, we had some positive swings. So a lot of pollsters will be picking apart this result to see what both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton can potentially take away from this result. It's going to be the closest one to a federal election, which we now know will not be happening on April 12. We now know because of ex-tropical cyclone Alfred that that's going to be pushed out to May. So there'll be lots to learn for both sides from this.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I learned is that Roger Cook was definitely going to win this election after he made these comments about JD Vance.
JD Vance is a
Knob.
Look, if you missed that, that was him at a press conference being asked a series of questions. And, the question that got asked to him was, what do you think of one word to describe JD Vance? And this is what he come up with. He's since apologised for it. But I think that just goes to show, and a little bit about what we heard in that presser as well, where he's talking about a future made in WA. He's really speaking the language of the people. Like, as we've talked about time and time again on this podcast, is that during this cost of living crisis, people just want to see that someone's got their backs. And Roger Cook seems to be that person, and he seems to speak like the rest of us do. So something like that really does him favours. And I guess where this result in the state election is kind of pointing us is that the coalition never really stood a chance in WA, having lost the last two, and then this is the third that they've lost. A lot of the analysis that's come out has come out to say that the Libs didn't even campaign effectively in those places to begin with. Like, they kind of put their hands up, and as someone that lives in a Liberal safe seat, I've seen what that looks like, where the parties just give up and they're like, we're not in for a chance anyway. So the advice now for Peter Dutton and for the opposition is to just be in everyone's faces as much as they can and don't act like you're losing a battle, which I know is something that they're definitely probably taking notes on this morning.
Overseas now, Israel has announced it's cutting all electricity to Gaza. The country's energy minister confirming the move early this morning our time as they continue to push Hamas to accept a temporary extension of the first phase of their ceasefire agreement. In a statement to X, Eli Cohen, the minister, posted, "Enough with the talk, it's time for action," and that they would use every tool at their disposal to get all hostages home. This comes a week after the Netanyahu government announced it'd be pausing all aid deliveries into the Strip, another tactic to force the hand of Hamas.
A reminder, the first phase of the ceasefire deal between the two has already lapsed, but the second phase is yet to be agreed on. Hamas claims Israel is trying to get out of negotiating long-term peace in the region. So the question is, inevitably, are they negotiating at all? Well, a Hamas delegation did arrive in Egypt on Friday to discuss the ceasefire deal and to push for a potential second phase of the agreement, while Israel says it has accepted an invitation from US-backed mediators to send a delegation to Qatar on Monday.
Yeah, and the real fear here is that fighting could resume. Israel, a government insider, apparently spoke to Reuters and said that, we're going to give negotiations a real chance. But the language around that is concerning because they are pushing for this extension rather than saying, well, yeah, we're going to come to the table and we're going to get this second phase agreed on. Hamas wants that. Hamas is pushing for that. And Israel just isn't playing ball and instead is cutting aid and electricity to people who are already absolutely devastated. Their homes are rubble, So I'm sure that there are people who are watching this and what is unfolding, and they are really concerned about what's going to happen next.
And changing pace now, there are a few things as dangerous as the piping hot innards of a meat pie, and unfortunately, some footy fans have learnt that lesson the hard way over the weekend. We joke, but it is actually pretty serious. A Dragon supporter was filmed hurling a pie at a group of Bulldogs fans at an NRL game on Saturday in Sydney. St George Illawarra has come out to condemn the move and says it's helping the NRL with investigating whether there were any breaches of the Spectators' Code of Conduct.
Yeah, so how did this incident come to light? Like anything these days, someone filmed it and uploaded it to TikTok.
Yeah, of you. Yeah. Me getting hit. I will.
Yeah, so that was the angry Bulldogs fan who copped the pie, coming up to these guys and saying, "What are you filming? Me getting hit." Yeah. So, it's nice having things thrown at you as you're just standing there watching a footy game. Look, police have confirmed they are investigating this incident, but they did speak to a lot of spectators at the game. They didn't make any arrests at the time. So whether this is an arrestable offence remains to be seen, but they are looking into it. And the Dragons did end up losing the game 28-20.
Shock horror. And look, I can say that as a Dragon supporter, lifelong Dragon supporter whose greatest milestone is their grand final win in 2010, and nothing great has happened to the club since. And a bit of bad press is not doing us any favours. I mean, look, I saw this happen over the weekend, and yes, the journalist in me is saying, do the right thing, let's not get carried away at games. I've seen worse things happen at games, but I mean, this exact pie throwing incident was very nostalgic for me. It reminded me of high school.
Oh, God.
Because I went to an all-boys school, and anyone who went to an all-boys school in, the 2010s, the early 2000s.
In Western Sydney.
Yeah, you can testify to what went down. And look, there was a lot of food fights. There were a lot of food fights, and all I can say is I would have much rathered a meat pie to the face than a lemon to the face, which I had copped once or twice.
Oh, sure. Oh, I'm so sorry for you, Chris. That's awful. I mean, as long as the pie wasn't too hot.
Yeah.
I said, there's nothing worse than a really hot pie when it comes to injuries. Look, I can't relate, though. I went to an all-girls school, so we weren't having food fights.
Much more tame.
Much more tame. All right. Thank you, Chris. Before we go, we do have some exciting news here on The Briefing we'd like to share. From today, you'll be hearing Natasha Belling hosting our afternoon episodes. Tash, we are so excited to have you.
Sash, thank you so much. I am thrilled to be joining the wonderful team at The Briefing for the afternoon edition. So check out your feeds. It will drop by 4 p.m. every afternoon. It is basically the news headlines of the day as they're breaking in the afternoon. But also we will do a bit of a deep dive on the big issues of the day. So hope you can join us. Lots of fun ahead.
Looking forward to hearing you this Arvo, Tash. In the meantime, let's get into this morning's deep dive brought to you by Helen Smith, where she chats with the conservation group suing Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek.
Can you sue the government on behalf of the environment? And what could it accomplish? Well, the Wilderness Society has launched court action against Australia's Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek, alleging that she and her predecessors are not meeting the duties legally required for threatened species that would give them a better chance at surviving extinction. The group are arguing that the recovery plans for 11 species, including Tasmanian wedge-tailed eagles, greater gliders and lungfish, are not being met. And this isn't the first time the government's been taken to court over environmental concerns for the future. But the Environment Minister relayed that the government's invested more than $500 million on efforts to save nature plants and animals from extinction, doubling the funding. Sam Szoke-Burke is the Biodiversity Policy and Campaign Manager at the Wilderness Society. Sam, is taking a government minister to court a waste of time?
Absolutely not. We at the Wilderness Society take our duties on behalf of our supporters really seriously to be fighting as a voice for nature, and that can take a lot of different avenues of action, from marches on the streets through to private meetings with stakeholders through to actions like this court case. And we wouldn't be bringing a court case unless we thought that there was a serious, a lot at stake, and also that the court would be the right avenue for us to be resolving this issue.
So why are you taking Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek to court?
Well, the first thing to say is that, yes, this court case lists the current federal Environment Minister as the respondent, and that's because we are bringing it against the office of the federal Environment Minister. But we really think that this court case is about the problems of the failures of successive ministers. So minister after minister, government after government, for really, the past couple of decades, to prioritise Australia's pride and joy, which is its natural environment. And in particular, what I'm talking about is taking action to ensure the recovery of Australia's unique threatened species. This court case is all about what are called recovery plans, which are in Australia's federal environment law. And whenever the Environment Minister decides that a threatened species requires a recovery plan, the law says that a plan must be made and be enforced. We've got 11 species from all around the continent of Australia where the minister or a minister has previously decided that recovery plans are needed, and yet we still don't have them long after the timeline prescribed by the law.
Can you explain to me what a recovery plan is and why we need them? How do they work?
They're kind of like a recovery roadmap. And what they do is it's per species, and it's the subject of intense collaboration and research with scientists. The reason the federal government is doing it is often species live in multiple states, and so they need to be coordinating with different state or territory governments as well. And they contain three really important things. The first is a description of the populations of the species, so where they are, what their attributes are. The second is actions needed to enable those species to recover and to thrive in the wild. So those are kind of proactive actions. And then the third thing they talk about are the threats to those species. And often the threats are around threats to landscapes and natural environments that the species rely on for their survival. And these are the same landscapes that the Wilderness Society has been organising and campaigning to protect for years and years and years around the continent. And what's so important about recovery plans is that if the plan accurately lists what the threats to the species habitat are, the minister then can't make any future decision that's inconsistent with that recovery plan. And so that means that for the Bordens and Carnaby's black cockatoos in WA, for instance, that if there's a development project in the Jarrah forest, like a bauxite mine, which is what one of the massive threats to those species is, and it's up for federal approval and assessment, the Environment Minister is going to have to take a close look at those recovery plans and be bound to not make a decision inconsistent with them.
So are you saying that some of these recovery plans are not being honoured?
Well, it's true that sometimes recovery plans aren't paid enough attention as they should, but this case is actually about species that don't even have recovery plans. So sometimes they have had a recovery plan previously and it's long since expired, and so the government would not be following it. In other cases, like the adorable sandhill dunnart in South Australia, which I know we're on a podcast, but it is truly an visually adorable creature. A plan has never been made, despite reports of there being draft recovery plans from, well into the early 2000s. So there's kind of a cause and effect here about if you don't have a plan, then obviously the government's not going to be following it in the first place. So what we're really trying to do is get the government to use the tools at its disposal to actually be doing its job and prioritising Australia's world-class nature.
And do you think that you stand a chance at winning this case?
I have to be careful about how we talk about the prospects of success, just because we've had legal advice about that and we can't really talk about our legal advice. But we feel confident that we are the right organisation to be bringing this case because we know these species. We've campaigned for years and in some cases decades to protect them, but also the landscapes that they rely on for habitat or for breeding. And I would also just say that the law, we're going to court because we need the court to decide how binding these obligations are. But any person, any one of your listeners can have a look at the provision of the Act, and it very clearly says that a plan must be made. And so we're going to the court to make sure that the minister can't interpret must as maybe.
What do you say to the criticism that doing something like this is a waste of resources needed for more serious issues, and that this is just an ego exercise? What would you say to people who might see a case like this as that?
Well, we're going to court because this is an avenue that we can hopefully compel the government to do its job and to do its job in protecting these native species. But it's not only about an individual species. We view these species as really representing not only the landscapes that I've already kind of banged on about a bit, but also every other species that's currently lacking a plan. And if you think about it, these species if they are in good health, if they are recovering, it means the ecosystems they're existing in are as well. So another one of our species is the long-footed potteroo, which is found in tall forests in Victoria and New South Wales. That little potteroo is not only deserves to be protected in its own right, it's also fond of eating truffles and mushrooms, and kind of when it's doing that and kind of nosing its little pointy nose around the soil, it's distributing those materials through the forest and kind of providing an ecosystem function as well. And it's getting a bit complicated, but what I'm trying to say is all of these species fit inside this naturally functioning nature that really all of us as humans rely on for our survival as well. As soon as you have ecosystems starting to collapse, species starting to disappear, that's when all of a sudden there's water shortages in Perth because of development projects, or that's when certain native flora and fauna become harder to find. So we view this as really important and as deserving the resources.
Do you think the current government has done enough to protect the environment during its leadership?
Well, we've engaged closely with the government on a number of processes at the federal level, and it's been a disappointing term of government. But I would add to that this is not the first term that's been the case. The whole reason we're bringing this case is because we think that there's a kind of crisis within the mindset of government from both sides of politics that seems to be just ignoring nature. So you go back to the 1980s and you have people like Bob Hawke and Graham Richardson, who were entirely political animals but still saw how important the natural environment was to Australians and used their political skills to prioritise nature, to put it in the place that it belongs and to make decisions that had political costs and political impacts, but that ultimately safeguarded important parts of nature for future generations of Australia. And really, for government after government this millennia, we're just not seeing that sort of prioritisation.
Does the government's actions on the environment impact how you think people should vote in the upcoming federal election this year?
How people should vote is really not for us to say. We're a charitable organisation and have kind of a very clear delineation. But I would say that poll after poll shows that the percentage of Australians around the continent, including, yes, the East Coast, but also WA, where resources play such a prominent role in media and so on. It sits around over kind of 70% of Australians who want to see stronger environmental protections, who want to see protection of the critical habitat for threatened species. And those same polls sometimes ask, do you not want to see, stronger protection? So who's really against that? And it's in one poll, it was as low as 4% of people. So, as I say, we can't say how people should vote, but we think it's pretty clear that Australians around the continent take pride in the natural environment. It's our heritage, as it has been the cultural heritage of First Nations peoples around the continent for tens of thousands of years. And so I think there is political risk in ignoring what the majority of Australians are passionate about and want to see happen.
You mentioned there before, not just this government that we're in right now, but previous terms not prioritising the environment. Why do you think the government isn't prioritising it?
It's a really good question. I think Australia isn't the only country to kind of experience this dislocation between what the majority of Australians are clamouring for versus what governments or major parties think they need to be prioritising or representing. But I think that there's definitely concerns among Australians about the kind of corporate capture and the outsized influence of fossil fuel companies and billionaires on not only the media landscape, but on kind of politicians and who they think they're really representing. And in a way, that's another reason why we are bringing this case, because we truly believe that the government's job should be to represent the passions and concerns of Australians. And we know that in this case, that means Australians are actually wanting to see a bold vision for nature. They're wanting to see a government that's willing to stake out its vision, make sure it's bold and ambitious, and then actually implement it and get the job done.
It's not often that we see massive decisions coming out of the environmental court or environmental cases in Australia. But what do you want people to take away from this court action?
We're really trying to bring the plight of these species to everybody's attention. We really believe that something is terribly wrong if government after government isn't interested in doing what Australians want and actually safeguarding this precious and unique natural environment that we all benefit from, that we all enjoy spending time in one way or another. So the court case is designed to hopefully compel whoever may be the future Environment Minister and ministers after that to do their job to prioritise Australia's environment. And we really don't think that asking the Environment Minister, who should be nature's biggest champion, asking that minister to comply with what the environment law says, for us, that's really not a high bar. That should be the bare minimum. So we're going to court to hopefully compel that action and start to see a renewed prioritisation of nature for future governments.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see what the outcome is, and we'll be following along with it closely. But Sam, thanks so much for joining us here on The Briefing.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Sam Szoke-Burke there, the Biodiversity Policy and Campaign Manager at the Wilderness Society. And we'll definitely be following this case, and if there's any major updates, we'll be sure to bring them to you. But that's it for this episode of The Briefing. While you're there, if you could follow or subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast on, it really does help us keep pumping out the content and bringing you episodes that you love. And hey, if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed this afternoon from 3. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.